On March 17th, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin for atrocities in Ukraine. This was a historic moment. It's the first time a major world leader has been indicted by the International Criminal Court. How will this affect the course of world events? I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast of Talking Foreign Policy, our expert panelists, including the Executive Director of the International Bar Association, a former prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, and a Nobel Peace Prize nominated peace negotiator, will discuss the international ramifications of the Putin indictment. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, the quarterly radio program and podcast brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In our fall 2022 broadcast, Talking Foreign Policy examined the possibility that Vladimir Putin could be indicted by the International Criminal Court, also known as the ICC for short. Since then, speculation has become reality. On March 17th, the ICC issued an arrest warrant for the Russian leader, charging him with the war crime of abducting thousands of Ukrainian children and transferring them to Russia for adoption. This is the first time the ICC has indicted a major world leader. It's a foreign policy game changer that merits further discussion by our expert panelists. We will begin by discussing the details of the Putin indictment. Next, we'll discuss the likely geopolitical impact. And in the final segment, we'll discuss whether a new international tribunal should be established to prosecute the crime of Russian aggression. Joining us today from London, England, is Dr. Mark Ellis, the Executive Director of the International Bar Association. Mark has worked closely with the Prosecutor General of Ukraine to prepare for prosecution of Russian war crimes cases. It is great to have you on the program, Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be with you.
And we are joined from the nation's capital by Professor Rebecca Hamilton of American University Washington College of Law. Professor Hamilton has served as a lawyer in the prosecutorial division of the International Criminal Court and as the Washington Post's special correspondent on Sudan. Thanks for joining us, Beck.
Thanks, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Also joining us from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Peace Prize nominated NGO. Paul has served as legal advisor in 24 peace negotiations and is the author of the recently published book, Lawyering Peace. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, my friend.
Oh, thank you, Michael. I'm excited to be back.
And finally, joining us from New York, who is Milena Stereo, who is usually in our studio. Now, Milena was just awarded the highest accolade in academia, the Distinguished University Professorship at Cleveland State University. Milena is an expert in international criminal justice, and just last year she joined me in making an amicus argument before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It's great to have you back on Talking Foreign Policy, Milena, even if you're on the road.
It's great to be back, Michael.
Now, let's start things off with Milena. Can you give us a little background about the ICC? How does it have the authority to indict the president of Russia, which isn't even a party to the treaty creating the court?
That's a great question, Michael. The ICC is the only permanent international court in the world. It is located in The Hague, Netherlands, and it has jurisdiction to prosecute individuals accused of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. And normally, the court has jurisdiction in situations where the crimes are committed on the territory of a member state or the crimes are committed by a national of a member state. And in this case, neither Russia nor Ukraine are actually members of the ICC. But the reason that the ICC has jurisdiction is because Ukraine has used a special procedure available under the statute of the court to accept the jurisdiction of the court on an ad hoc basis. And so after the Russian attack on Crimea in 2014, Ukraine launched a special declaration with the court, thereby accepting the jurisdiction of the court for any crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine starting in 2014 and on. And it's because of that special declaration that Ukraine has launched that the ICC now has jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes in Ukraine committed by Russian forces.
Well, let me now turn to our former international prosecutor, Beck Hamilton. Beck, what crime has the ICC charged President Putin of committing?
So they've issued an arrest warrant relating to 2 war crimes charges connected to the alleged unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children from occupied areas of Ukraine into the Russian Federation.
All right, so tell us what's necessary to prove that crime, and what evidence do you think the ICC has of Putin's responsibility for that?
So I should say I don't have any inside intel on what evidence the ICC has. But interestingly, there's already been a lot of public reporting around the documentation of this unlawful transfer program. And what we've seen is incredible open source intelligence collection and digital evidence collection that actually shows the routes that these children have been taken and the sorts of things that were told to their families and communities regarding the circumstances of their transfer.
And so literally as many as 16,000 or more kids have been taken out of Ukraine, sent to Russia, and they're trying to get them adopted and transformed into new Russian citizens. Is that the idea here?
That is exactly the concern. And I should say there's somebody else charged alongside Putin, which is his Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. And she's very much been the public face of this program. She herself is very public about the fact that she's adopted a teenager from Mariupol. And in the public statements that the ICC has issued, the prosecution is claiming that it can demonstrate an intention to permanently deprive these children from being raised in their own country.
But in this case, they're going to be prosecuted for a war crime, not the crime of genocide. And that's curious to me because after World War II, the German officials were tried at Nuremberg for a similar crime, abducting thousands of Polish children for adoption in Germany. But there, the German officials were charged with genocide and convicted. Beck, why do you think the ICC didn't charge Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova with genocide?
I would say they have not charged them yet. I think that remains a possibility. So what we have in this initial war crimes charge is, as you said, acts that would meet what we call the actus reus, or the bad action of genocide, as well as meeting it for a war crime. The difficulty with a genocide charge is that in addition to proving that this unlawful transfer and deportation program has been taking place, you also have to prove that it was done with a specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group, probably the nationality of Ukrainians. And the hardest part of any genocide charge is always proving that specific intent. So what I think is interesting here is we might see the prosecution succeed at making the war crimes charge that will show it has the underlying bad act involved for the genocide charge, that is in the process giving it time to build the evidence to show the specific intent for genocide.
So let me turn to Paul Williams. Paul, your NGO, the Public International Law and Policy Group, has assisted every international criminal tribunal in modern times. So from that broad perspective, why do you think the ICC charged the crime of child abduction when there are so many other atrocities that are also being committed by Russians in the Ukraine?
Well, Michael, I think there are three reasons why the International Criminal Court has focused on children. The first is it resonates. When you talk about kidnapping, stealing children, the general public understands what you're talking about. Now, we would think as experts that, well, crime against humanity, war crimes, genocide, that's perfectly understandable. But oftentimes the public gets confused quite easily with the technicalities. Kidnapping children, we all know that's wrong. The second, as Beck mentioned earlier briefly, Putin's already confessed to this. He's proud of the fact that he's taking these children from Ukraine and giving them proper homes in Russia. Again, he kidnaps them or steals them to bring them to Russia as part of diluting or destroying the Ukrainian identity. But it's a pretty clear cut case when Putin gets on TV and says, yes, I'm doing this. And then the third reason is it narrows the body of evidence that needs to be addressed at the trial. Unfortunately, the international community, international criminal courts have fallen into a pattern of indicting senior leadership for everything. And these trials are 2 to 3 years long. And weirdly, they lose their relevance during that period of time. So this is focused, it resonates, and when he does show up in custody, he can be tried in a fairly rapid fashion.
It sounds like the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, has been very strategic in bringing this indictment. Let me turn to Mark Ellis. Mark, as executive director of the International Bar Association, you've been involved in helping Ukraine and the ICC document the many different atrocities that are being committed by Russian forces in the conflict. Can you tell us about your efforts?
Yeah, I think, really at the forefront or at the start of the war, I think for us, the IBA, we wanted to really assist Ukraine, and particularly in this area of ensuring accountability for the atrocity crimes that were being committed. So we entered into memorandum of understandings with the prosecutor's office, but also with the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Justice, and the National School of Judges. And this was to kind of holistically look at what we could do to assist in the accountability efforts. And one of the most important projects is collecting pictorial evidence of these atrocities. And although Ukraine can be seen as the most documented war in history, with endless number of photos and videos on social media. We see it all day. But their authenticity can't be verified. So the IBA created this project called Eyewitness to Atrocities. And Michael, you'll remember we launched that at Case Western a number of years ago.
I sure do.
But the Eyewitness app allows you to record videos and pictures, and all of that is embedded with the metadata, the time, date, location needed to demonstrate their authenticity in court. And so with the support of the Prosecutor's General's Office, we've collected over 35,000 pictures and videos, and we've submitted 24 cases to investigative entities. So that's
so,
what we're
Mark,
doing.
if there are going to be additional indictments of Putin based on what you're seeing, all the evidence you've gathered, what do you think some of the other most significant war crimes have been that have been documented that would be good ones for the ICC to pursue next?
I've been to Ukraine twice now during the war, and I think obviously the list of war crimes is unfathomably long. But the most striking element for me when I was there was to see kind of firsthand the intentional targeting of civilians, and particularly civilian objects, and then the kind of the indiscriminate shelling of areas where civilians live. But I thought one of the most egregious acts that Russia has undertaken is the target and indiscriminate shelling of hospitals. Oh, yeah. And this comes back to what Eyewitness has been able to do with this case filing. And for 30 days, Ukraine's healthcare infrastructure was attacked. Michael, every single day, up to 5 hospitals targeted each day. And this is just part of that widespread and systematic attack as a state policy. These are war crimes, they're crimes against humanity. And this is what we've documented in a very powerful submission to the ICC.
Oh, these things are really horrific. Well, it's time for us to take a short break. When we return, we're going to be talking about the geopolitical implications of the Putin indictment. So stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media, heard quarterly here on 89.7 WKSU. I'm Michael Scharf, the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm joined today from London, England, by the Executive Director of the International Bar Association, Mark Ellis. From Washington, D.C., by a former prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, Professor Rebecca Hamilton, and also in Washington by the President of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Paul Williams. And finally, from New York, by Professor Milena Stereo of Cleveland State University College of Law. In this segment of our show, we're going to be discussing the geopolitical ramifications of the indictment of Vladimir Putin. Let's start with a question for Beck Hamilton, the former prosecutor at the ICC. As someone who has experience with how the ICC operates, there's something I wonder if you can explain. The ICC has not yet made the actual charges against Putin public. Instead, as you mentioned before, it issued a press statement with a bare-bones summary. What's the significance of that?
So I don't know, Michael, really why they've done that. The only thing I can speculate on from the outside is whether there might be something in the charging document where someone with knowledge might be able to use that material to perhaps identify a witness for whom they haven't nailed down a protection scheme for yet. Or frankly, it might be some much more benign bureaucratic detail. But I don't think that we should let it distract us too much, because I'm confident that they wouldn't have gone ahead unless the charging document was solid.
So, Beck, the next step could be a confirmation of charges hearing. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So this is a big shift for the prosecution to move from getting the arrest warrant to getting the charges confirmed, because they have to demonstrate to the court their evidence at a higher level of proof. So for the arrest warrant to be issued, they just needed to convince the court there were reasonable grounds to believe that the defendants committed this crime. For the confirmation of charges, they have to show substantial grounds to believe. Now, ideally, you will have your defendants present at the confirmation of charges hearing, but there is provision for it to be done in absentia. And this is also the time where, if any charges are going to be amended or withdrawn, those details can be nutted out. But basically, the prosecution puts on its evidence, and it doesn't bring in witnesses, but it usually produces a summary document. And the pretrial chamber decides whether to confirm the charges, at which point it will assign the case to a trial chamber.
So, Beck, if the court is going to put on the evidence, is it kind of like a mini trial where people who are watching it on TV will start to see all the videos that Mark Ellis has been talking about and the other evidence against Putin?
So emphasis on the mini part of that. So it is pretty different in that you're not bringing any witnesses into play. But yes, there will often be some documentary evidence put on at that stage.
So let me turn to Paul Williams. Paul, Beck said that, usually they would try to get the defendant there for the confirmation of charges, but not necessarily. What do you think the actual likelihood is that Vladimir Putin is going to end up before the ICC in The Hague?
Well, Michael, this is the question that most of my neighbors ask me when I'm out walking Scrappy and we get into a conversation about about Ukraine. You're the lawyer. Why indict Putin? He'll never end up in the tribunal. But then I talk about President Charles Taylor of Liberia, who was never going to end up. He was tried. He's in detention in London. President Milosevic of Serbia, how strongman of Serbia, How could he ever end up before the Yugoslav tribunal? He died while he was, the third year of his trial. The Cambodian leadership for the genocide against the Cambodian people, they've stood trial. There really is a long arm of the law. Now, who knows when or why? Do the oligarchs get tired of having their money repurposed, frozen and repurposed and given to Ukraine, and so they topple Putin? It's an easy exit to send someone to The Hague. It gets them out of the domestic political scene. Cross our fingers, we have a democratic transformation in Russia. First thing they're going to want to do is put Putin on a plane and get him out of Russia so they can get on with their democratic transition. So put me in the optimistic category, Michael.
Good for you. Let me turn to Mark Ellis. Now, Mark, I don't think you have a dog that you walk, but I'm sure this issue comes up a lot in your conversations. What's your thinking on it?
Well, I think you have to be realistic. I don't think you can suggest that Putin is going to be arrested and surrendered to the ICC anytime soon. I don't expect that. I think he will, particularly considering his current kind of firm grip on power, and that will weaken. I have always said, Michael, time and time again, that international justice plays the long game. And landscapes change. Paul just alluded to this. So a leader who has adulation of his citizens can see it fade away, and we've seen it by the exact individuals that Paul had just mentioned. So I think overall history shows that leaders accused of these types of atrocity crimes, as we have seen with Mr. Putin, do eventually face justice. So I'm optimistic.
All right, so assuming, as Mark said, that it's unlikely that Vladimir Putin will find himself in the custody of the ICC, quote, anytime soon, I'd like to ask our experts what they think the geopolitical importance is of the court's indictment now. Let's go back to Paul Williams, and I want to ask, how do you think the indictment has affected the sanctions imposed on Russia?
Well, Michael, the value of an indictment is that, sometimes there is good and evil. And oftentimes in the economic universe or the political universe, there's a lot of, intentional ambiguity or accommodation. But when the president of the country is indicted for stealing and kidnapping children, that's evil. That provides support for these sanctions, the sanctions regimes. It also provides support for the weapons transfers that the United States and its NATO allies are providing to Ukraine. And so I think it's important to bring moral clarity, and I emphasize that because, in the 30 years you and I, Michael, have been working on this, and back at our State Department days, policy 101 sometimes is to make ambiguous this moral clarity. Having justice play the long game, calling it as they see it, helps us to understand that there actually is good and evil in this contest.
So, Paul, assuming that that's correct, the ICC's indictment doesn't seem to be affecting the trade policies of India, which is currently the largest importer of Russian oil. What do you make of that? Why aren't the Indians being convinced of this evil that the indictment is showing?
India is playing the short-term tactical game of basically receiving an economic windfall by being able to purchase Russian oil at a deep discount because of the oil camp. But they are making a major strategic mistake in the long game. Russia-Ukraine is about territorial integrity, and Russia is basically a territorial grab of Ukrainian territory. China has its eyes on Indian territory. There is, quite a bit of consternation between China and India should be doubling down on the sanctions against Russia in order to send that strong signal that China should keep its territorial ambitions, not only with Taiwan, but with India and some of its other neighbors, to keep those ambitions in check.
I want to ask Mark Ellis a question about China, because the indictment was announced just 2 days before the president of China, Xi Jinping, visited President Putin in Moscow. And I want to know, Mark, how you think the indictment is affecting the Chinese-Russian relationship.
Well, we know that neither Russia or China is a state party to the ICC, and neither country has really shown any interest in, abiding by the confines of international criminal law. So China would certainly not abide by kind of any perceived responsibility to arrest Mr. Putin during his next visit to the country. So, I don't think the arrest warrant will have much impact on Russia-China relations. The only thing I can hope for is that over the short time, maybe medium, long-term time, that it causes at least a moment of pause for China, and particularly President Xi, that there is now collaboration between China and an indicted war criminal. And that's what I hope.
Mark, I think that moment of pause actually happened because right before President Xi went to Moscow, the press was reporting that they thought that there was going to be a military deal, which Putin really needs, because the situation right now is that the West is arming Ukraine and Russia is running out of military equipment. And so other than North Korea, they really don't have these sources, and they needed it from China. So when President Xi went up to Moscow, the idea was that he was going to do a handshake and announce a big, giant military effort. That didn't happen. And I wonder if it wasn't because of the timing of the indictment.
I'm not sure that has much to do with the timing of the indictment as it is to the reality of what's happening in the war. China certainly does not have much interest in supporting Russia if Russia is seen as weak and will in the end not succeed. So I tend to lean more in that direction.
All right. So, Milena, we heard earlier from both Mark and Paul about the fact that indictments tend to erode leaders' grips on power. I suppose it's really hard to do your job when everybody refers to you as indicted international criminal Vladimir Putin. So I wonder if you think that there might be a short-term consequence because of the indictment and not just a long-term erosion of power.
Well, the very immediate and short-term consequence for someone like Vladimir Putin is that he can no longer travel the world freely. For example, Putin was slated to attend the so-called BRIC summit in South Africa later this year. South Africa is a member of the ICC, and it's doubtful whether Putin will actually be able to travel to this summit. And there are multiple other countries that are members of the ICC where Putin could not travel to. And so that certainly inhibits his ability to conduct foreign relations and to truly act as a world leader in the global arena. So in addition to these perhaps longer-term consequences where perhaps he will actually face justice someday in The Hague, there are immediate short-term consequences which make it much more difficult for him to act as a leader.
All right, I want to now go back to Paul Williams, who has so much experience in negotiating peace agreements. If there is going to be a negotiated end to the Ukraine conflict and Vladimir Putin is still in power, what does the indictment mean for the role that Putin can play in those negotiations?
Well, Michael, I think fortunately it means that President Putin could only play a very limited role, and that this, in fact, will narrow the scope of the negotiations. It's clear that Ukraine is intending to regain all of its territory that's been occupied by Russia, the Donbas, Crimea. What I worry about is this summer offensive, which seems to be beginning right about now, is successful, and then Ukraine's allies almost instantaneously wobble and take the bait if Russia were to offer ceasefire negotiations or some other type of negotiations. And we've seen this with Minsk I, Minsk II, the earlier ceasefire agreements. Russia uses them to their advantage. Having Putin indicted for these crimes, these war crimes, creates less space for Ukraine's allies to wobble in Ukraine's effort to retake its territory. Now, yes, this means a longer-term conflict, but a conflict that will restore Ukraine to its full territorial integrity and deter Russia from future aggression in Ukraine and from future aggression against its neighboring states, a handful of which are NATO members.
So let me do a follow-up for Milena Stereo. The ICC statute actually has a really interesting little provision that nobody's focused too much about. It enables the UN Security Council to order the court to defer prosecution in the interest of peace. In other words, if the Security Council believes that the indictment is the bargaining chip that's necessary to restore peace and security, they can do that. And all it would take is for Russia to vote to immunize itself, China to vote in favor of its buddy, Russia, and to get the U.S., France, and the U.K. on board. Do you think that might be invoked as a condition of peace in the Ukraine, Milena?
So that's a very interesting question, and I'm glad, Michael, you're mentioning this provision of the ICC statute, which, as you correctly pointed out, not that many people have focused on. The question to me is really whether Putin is still in power or not. If Putin is still in power, then I cannot foresee any type of a situation where that situation is not invoked because Russia has a seat on the Security Council, and Putin would clearly say, no way to any type of, ICC involvement here, any prospects of facing justice. If Putin is no longer in power, which, as we've been discussing, a long-term consequence of the indictment could be, at some point in the future, Putin's fall from power, a subsequent Russian regime could presumably, play with this provision of the Security Council and this provision from the Rome Statute and say essentially, we'll come to the negotiating table, we'll negotiate peace, but the ICC investigation has to cease. So I do think it's a very, very interesting and complicated question, and I think it really depends on who is in power in Russia.
The last point you made is interesting because when Slobodan Milosevic was surrendered by Serbia to the Hague, in that case it was the Yugoslavia Tribunal, Serbia got $100 million in foreign assistance from the European Union in return for surrendering Milosevic. And someone quipped at the time that he was the biggest export in the history of that country. So I wonder if, some future regime in Russia won't see surrendering Putin as part of the bargaining chip for a peace plan. Let me go in our final couple of seconds for this segment and ask Beck Hamilton, how do you think the indictment of Putin is going to affect the long-term legacy of the International Criminal Court?
Hugely positive. I think it's great for the ICC to show that it can operate outside of the African continent, which is where the bulk of its cases have been. And not only that it is willing and able to go after the head of a state that is a permanent 5 member of the UN Security Council. So it is really asserting its role on the global stage in a case that has a lot of, as Paul has said, moral clarity behind it. So I think this is good news overall for the ICC.
All right, well, it's time for another short break. When we return, we're going to be talking about the proposal to establish a tribunal to prosecute Putin for the crime of aggression. We'll be back in a moment. You're tuned in to Talking Foreign Policy, a production of Case Western Reserve University and The Sound of Ideas, heard quarterly here on 89.7 WKSU. I'm Michael Scharf, the Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm joined today by experts on prosecuting war crimes. In this final segment, we're going to be discussing the proposal to establish a tribunal to prosecute Vladimir Putin for the crime of aggression. Milena Stereo, can you kick things off by explaining what the crime of aggression is and why the International Criminal Court does not have the power to charge Vladimir Putin with that crime?
The crime of aggression is probably the most controversial crime within the statute of the International Criminal Court. And the crime of aggression consists of a use of force by one state against the political independence, territorial integrity, or sovereignty of another state. In the case of Russia versus Ukraine, it is abundantly clear that Russia has committed aggression against Ukraine. But because the crime of aggression is so controversial, it was only added to the statute of the International Criminal Court at the so-called Kampala Review Conference in 2010, and it was added subject to a much more limited jurisdictional regime, which basically requires that both the aggressor state and the victim state be members of the ICC. In this particular instance, Russia and Ukraine are not members of the ICC, and as we discussed earlier, the only reason the court has jurisdiction is because Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the court, but Ukraine could only do so with respect to genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and not with respect to aggression. So we're stuck with a situation where the court does have jurisdiction over the three other crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, however, does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression.
And you know, Milena, I was actually in Kampala in 2010 during those negotiations, and I remember it wasn't Russia so much as the United States and the United Kingdom who had been accused of acting aggressively in Iraq, who were trying to limit their exposure to the crime of aggression. So, as you said, they put in all of these obstacles. And I'm wondering, Milena, would it be possible for the parties of the ICC treaty to amend the statute again, this time to enable the ICC to prosecute the Russian leaders for the crime of aggression?
Sure. Amendments to the ICC statute are in theory possible. However, they require, as a general matter, the agreement of 2/3 of states parties to the ICC. The ICC has over 120 member states. And so with respect to aggression, because this crime is so controversial, as you correctly outlined, it is doubtful that we'd be able to get to a two-thirds majority of member states of the ICC. So in theory, this is possible, but in practice, it is unlikely.
So let me turn to Mark Ellis. If the ICC cannot try Russian leaders for the crime of aggression, can the domestic courts of Ukraine or other countries in Europe try the perpetrators of that crime?
Well, challenging, I would say. But first, we should clarify for atrocity crimes, definitely yes. And I think it's worth mentioning that from the beginning of this war, a number of states have launched investigations into Russia's atrocity crimes. And this has been through the principle of universal jurisdiction, which allow countries to kind of bring criminal proceedings in their own courts, irrespective of where the crime took place. But for states interested in pursuing Mr. Putin for the crime of aggression, that too would have to go through the concept of universal jurisdiction. But there are lots of legal hurdles to this approach. So as long as Putin is a sitting head of state, he'll be immune from being prosecuted by another state. However, of course, once he leaves office, that immunity, I think, will disappear for the crimes he's committed. For Ukraine, though, its criminal code does include the crime of aggression. But this, too, I think, will be problematic. There's a lot of procedural issues, constitutional issues. But most importantly, Michael, the crime of aggression is and should be always seen as an international crime. It shouldn't be relegated to Ukraine. It should be something the international community undertakes, and this is the time to do it.
Well, and it seems that the thing that is at the heart of the crime of aggression is that it's a leadership crime. It's not like war crimes that can be committed by lower-level people. It's got to be committed from the top. And if that's the case, as you were mentioning, Mark, this head of state immunity issue can be a real problem to any domestic prosecutions of crimes of the crime of aggression. Let me ask, Milena, what's the international precedent on head of state immunity? Can you explain that to our listeners?
Sure. So head of state immunity attaches to political leaders and foreign policy leaders of countries. So typically we say that presidents, prime ministers, and foreign ministers, foreign affair ministers, benefit from this principle of head of state immunity. So to apply this concretely to the situation in Russia right now, that means that Putin and Lavrov would benefit from head of state immunity. However, all the other Russian leaders, including, for example, Maria Belova-Lvova, who you mentioned, including army generals, including many other political and military leaders, they would not actually benefit from head of state immunity. So it's an important principle, but it really only attaches to 2, maybe 3 individuals at most.
So I wonder if the crime of aggression is so important in this case to at least indict and have the evidence out there, and you could have the heads of state, Putin and the foreign minister Lavrov, as unindicted co-conspirators, right? Is that so important that they ought to think about prosecuting lower level people? So, members of the Duma, that's the Russian parliament, or the Russian National Security Council, or top generals who were involved in the decision making. Paul, do you have a thought on that?
Well, Michael, I think that the international community and the Ukrainians as well have shown themselves all in on accountability for these atrocity crimes. And on accountability for aggression. If the international community, I agree with Mark, it's an international crime, but if the international community is not willing or able to step up to the plate and create a tribunal or amend the jurisdiction of an existing tribunal, it's up to the Ukrainians. So I wouldn't go for second best and say, well, you can't really get the top tier leadership, so let's go after the second tier. I think the focus has to be on the top tier, and clever lawyers can find ways to pierce this immunity, to create a hybrid tribunal, to create an internationalized domestic tribunal. I think this needs to be a full court press to keep accountability in the game that we have.
And you mentioned this idea of an internationalized domestic tribunal, Paul. I know that your NGO, the Public International Law and Policy Group, has worked with the Ukrainian jurists and legal experts last summer to draft a model statute for a high Ukraine war crimes court that would have jurisdiction over not just war crimes, but also the crime of aggression. Can you tell us about that initiative?
Yeah, Michael, the Ukrainians are committed to an international tribunal to bring Putin and Lavrov and others to account for the crime of aggression. But as a backup plan, the Ukrainians want to be prepared to do it themselves. And this tribunal, the draft statute, Michael, which you co-led, the effort, along with some of our law firm colleagues and friends, essentially would design a mechanism that, as a last resort, the Ukrainians could use in a way that would be internationalized or hybrid. And again, the Ukrainians are the victims of this crime of aggression. They're the victims of these atrocities. In a sense, they almost have right of first refusal to prosecute these crimes. And I would just make a point, you and I and others on this program have dealt quite extensively with countries over the years. The Ukrainians have really stepped up to seek to employ international and domestic mechanisms to hold the Russian leadership accountable for crimes. And they realize that it limits the options in the peace process, but they're all in. And I'm pleased to see that.
And Paul, you mentioned that there were some other alternatives that are being considered in international spheres. There have, for example, been proposals to create a new international tribunal for the crime of aggression. And it just happens that Beck Hamilton, who's with us today, has been involved in that effort. Beck, can you tell us about that?
Sure. So this is the model that is Ukraine's first choice, and it is gaining, or it has the support of Ukraine's neighbors in the region. And the reason fundamentally is that it is the model that has the best chance of overcoming this head of state immunity that we've been talking about, so that it will be the court that can credibly charge a Putin or a Lavrov. And the sort of mechanism through which it would be established would involve an agreement with the UN General Assembly. So that is the gold standard from Ukraine's perspective, which I agree here with Paul. I think Ukraine's voice has been crystal clear on this, and it's sort of incumbent on the rest of us to do everything we can to support them in that effort.
So weirdly, Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has been one of the voices against that effort. Milena, can you explain what might be the ICC prosecutor's concern on that?
Yeah, so Michael, I think you and I were both in The Hague, where I think Paul might have been there with us as well, when Prosecutor Khan, back in December of 2022, publicly stated how he was against the creation of another aggression tribunal, and in fact that he favored essentially, focusing the resources at the ICC and having all Ukraine-related prosecutions at the ICC. I think it's a question of the focus and the resources that the international community has to devote to this crisis. And I think he is somewhat concerned that if the international community starts creating additional tribunals, it will then divert its focus and resources and attention from the ICC to these other accountability mechanisms, and that might negatively affect the ICC. And so I think he is, for now, in favor of keeping everything with the ICC.
And it's not just Karim Khan. The U.S. government has said that they don't believe there are enough votes in the UN to establish an international aggression tribunal. Paul, what are the world politics of this issue?
Well, Michael, I'm afraid, to be honest, I think that there's genuinely a thin commitment to the principles of accountability and justice. I remain optimistic and I guess I'd say I remain hopeful that there will be an international tribunal. But oftentimes countries discuss accountability and justice in press releases. But when it comes time to create a tribunal for aggression, I think there are a lot of countries that are seeking comfort and safety in so-called neutrality or impartiality. There's also the dimension of whether or not this would be a standing aggression tribunal to prosecute aggression anywhere around the world, or whether it would be specifically focused on Russia and Ukraine. And I do think that gives some countries pause for supporting it.
Well, and even
if it's the UN, Michael, it's UN politics.
Paul, even if it's not a standing tribunal, if one is created, then that's a precedent. Another one could be created, and another one. And if it's not controlled by the Security Council, for example, where the U.S. and other major powers have a veto, it means the General Assembly could start creating these. And I'm sure that some countries find that a little disconcerting. Beck, do you think that that's what's behind the U.S. government's concerns about this, or is there something else?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Michael. It is establishing a precedent that means that this issue of aggression can be done. Countries in the world can do an end run around the UN Security Council when there is a member of the council with a veto that is implicated. And the US position has always been that aggression should be dealt with at the level of the UN Security Council. This current situation has shown why that system is broken. It doesn't work if you have to go through the UN Security Council when one of the permanent members is implicated. So, to be fair to the US government, I think they've come a long way in a very short time. When we think of their position at Kampala, you wouldn't have imagined that they would have supported the notion of the criminalization of aggression really at all. So there have been some shifts, but I think this particular situation just shows why the current system for dealing with aggression is broken. And we need to invest now in something that is more sustainable for the future.
And Paul said facetiously, it's the UN politics, Michael. And one of the reasons he said that is because in a prior job, I was attorney advisor for UN affairs, so I was steeped in those politics. But Mark, let me ask you, what do you think the likelihood is of the establishment of an aggression tribunal through the UN General Assembly? Do you think the votes are there?
I don't think the votes are there. I wish they were there. I think we need to remind ourselves that when it comes to General Assembly voting, roughly 40%, representing 50% of the world's population, have not outwardly condemned Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And so the idea of moving to a type of resolution from the General Assembly to create a special tribunal, I think is going to be a tough challenge. But I think we should remember this, and I remember when I first visited Ukraine during the war, nobody was really talking about the crime of aggression. 6 months later, that's all everyone was talking about, the need to create this type of special tribunal. So as much as I would like it to be international, if it has to be internationalized in order to get the support of the United States, the UK, Germany, others, then I think that's the direction we should head, even though there will be some legal hurdles there in regards to immunity issues. But we'll get there. I'm convinced that there will, in fact, be a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. It's just an issue of what's the modality.
And you know, one of the things I remember from my work at the UN was that UN politics can change really quickly in response to events on the ground. So in this context, such events could include if Russia commits a particularly heinous atrocity, if they resort to strategic nukes, or if they hit with a regular weapon one of Ukraine's nuclear power plants, if Putin is killed or falls from power, if Ukraine prevails militarily. Any of those things could be game changers. So let me ask our experts, how do you think such events might affect the establishment of a tribunal for the crime of aggression? Let's start with Beck.
So I really appreciate the point that political will here is not static. Events shift perceptions. And also there's an element of, I wouldn't say I'm trying to remain an optimist regarding UN General Assembly dynamics, because I think we risk running into a self-fulfilling prophecy where we say, it doesn't really seem like the political will is there, and then we stop trying to build the political will. I think we need to make the case in order for it to happen, and certainly as events change on the ground, that can help us make the case for the need for international accountability for the crime of aggression. I do think if Putin was killed, for example, it would probably take some of the demand away for a truly international tribunal, to the extent that the value add of an international tribunal, or one of its main value adds, is that it can actually reach over personal immunities and get to Putin. So there might be some shift in which particular model is preferred if we saw that happen.
I think that's a good place for us to wrap things up. It's time for us to bring our program to a close. I'd like to thank our experts for being with us today and for helping us understand the ramifications of the indictment of Vladimir Putin by the International Criminal Court and the prospects for the creation of a new international court for the crime of aggression. Mark Ellis, Paul Williams, Beck Hamilton, and Milena Stereo, thank you each for providing your insights about this important topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy, a production of Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. Heard here on 89.7 WKSU. Thanks for tuning in.